So welcome everyone. My name's Chris Alexander. I'm Director of Strategic Reform at ECA, and I'll be chairing the fantastic session we've got today. And being a virtual meeting, we're coming together from all around Australia. In my case, I'm in Perth. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Whadjuk Budjar people. So that's Perth land. And I'm standing quite near the Swan River, which is Derwal Yerrigan. So I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. So we've got a fantastic session today, and I think the popularity of the session we've got, I think more than 150 people who have registered to attend is really an indication of the strength of our panel. So I'd like to shortly introduce Melanie Koerner, who will be presenting on this social licence for control of DR paper that we commissioned and that Melanie has authored, and also then joined for, I guess, reflections on the work and what it actually means in terms of applying some of these principles in practice. We'll have Vince Duffy, who's the Exec Director with the Department of Energy and Mining in South Australia. We've got Joe Witters, who's a Senior Policy Advisor with the ESB and has carried the post-2025 market redesign work. Violette, Mouchaileh, who's an Exec General Manager of Emerging Markets and Services at AEMO. And of course, Lynne Gallagher, who's the CEO of Energy Consumers Australia. So just quickly to the agenda today, and I will try and get through this quite quickly because it's a packed agenda, and it's like listening to podcasts where the introductions take too long. It's not the way to go. So what we're really trying to do today is zip through the presentation from Melanie. We'll then have some remarks from our panelists reflecting, then a sort of a panel discussion, and informed by the questions we get from you through the chat, and then we'll wrap up. And hopefully move on with some great feedback from the audience. So in terms of the format today, so this is obviously Zoom. Kerry Connors, who's my colleague at ECA, is going to be your voice. So please do use the Zoom chat function to pose any questions you might have for Melanie or our panelists. And I'll periodically go to Kerry for questions. This session is recorded. And the recording, along with the webinar slides, the report, will be available on our website. And I think I've seen a question from David Hertz around the availability of the report, and I think David's found the link on our website. So for others who are looking for the report, follow the link in the chat. And there's a hashtag as well, which is going to be hashtag DR control for the Twitterers among us. So please do engage as far as you can with the chat. And so I guess what I would like to do to start though is to put this report that we're discussing today into a context. And I guess at the highest level, at ECA, we're really interested in how we build consumer and community trust and confidence in the energy market, and that's an energy market and energy system in transition. So one of the questions we've been asking ourselves at ECA is sort of under what conditions will consumers, the community, participate, engage, support new technologies, new energy services in the context of this transition. And we thought that this question of control and how you build a social license for it was a really, really important foundation for that bigger question. So what we're really trying to do with this report, and I guess this webinar, is start a dialogue around these issues, because clearly DR already is and is going to become an increasingly important part of our energy system. So before I throw to Melanie to walk us through this great report, I might just ask Lynne to really briefly give people a sense of why we commissioned this report and how it fits into our bigger strategic view of consumers in contemporary and future energy markets. So thank you, Lynne.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. And it's great so many people participating today in this discussion. As Chris says, really we want to start a dialogue, and that's the context for this report and why we commissioned it. And it's really why people and their values or motivations matter in how the energy system is managed. Today's problem is one of uncontrolled generation from people's rooftops. But today's opportunity, and it's tomorrow's opportunity, is that people will play a significant role in managing their energy use, whether that's hot water, heating, cooling, electric vehicles, and they'll play a significant role in managing their generation. And in that context, so-called smart technology is the enabler to unlocking this control over generation and use. But using that same technology to take control away from people has consequences. It diverts efforts and resources into enforcing that control. It diminishes trust and creates a sense of unfairness. And the cost of the future energy system will be higher when people are less willing to be flexible in controlling their energy use and generation. So that's the background context for the report, and I'll hand back to Chris, and we'll move on to Melanie to go through the work.
Thank you, Lynne. So without further ado, we'll jump into the substantive part of the webinar today and hand to Melanie. Thank you, Melanie.
Great. Thanks, Chris, and thanks for everyone for your time today. So as Lynne and Chris have spoken about, CutlerMerz was commissioned by Energy Consumers Australia to undertake this study into the social licence for DER control. Go to the next slide, thanks. So I wanted to start off just by saying that the social licence for control we see as a critical component of enabling control of DER, and that enabling control of DER is critically important for the energy system. There are large benefits that come from control of DER. So we certainly don't want this report to come across as that the social licence should be preventing, the need for a social licence should be preventing control, that the social licence, enabling the social licence is critical to realising these benefits that we see here in terms of reduced investment in network assets, in terms of the distribution network by reducing peak demand, reducing costs in the wholesale market by providing demand response and shifting load during high solar times, environmental benefits where we can optimise renewable generation by more control and more flexible demand, then there's large environmental benefits that can be achieved. And of course, a lot of those benefits also drive down prices. So control is critical to achieving some of the energy system outcomes that you see there. Next slide. The definition that we developed for social licence is there on the screen. So we did a lot of research into the theory behind social licence and its genesis really in corporate social governance areas, and we've come up with this definition which adapts the definition of social licence used in those spheres to apply to DER control. So importantly, they are informal permissions that might be granted by stakeholders for government or energy institutions to undertake this decision making on behalf of energy consumers around how they operate DER. We define DER in the broadest sense here, so we're talking about demand response as well as behind the meter generation. And importantly, these permissions are above and beyond what is required by law. So just because governments or institutions have a legal ability to enact this control, they don't necessarily have the social licence, and there's costs and effort required to obtain and maintain those social licences above and beyond what's required by law. We talk about government or institutions here as well. So the social licence report focuses mostly on energy institutions and government rather than the sort of third party organisations who might be doing the control, because to our mind, it's these governments and institutions that regulate or prescribe how those third parties undertake the control. So our focus is really at the design at the program level of these DER control programs. Next slide. So we've taken this, this framework, which comes from Thompson and Boulier, which is a social license, which are the preconditions required for social license. This again comes from the corporate social governance field, but it has an equal application to DER control. There are 4 main attributes to obtaining a social license according to this theory. The first and most important to get to a level of acceptance is that economic legitimacy. So that is the perception that those who are subject to the control do perceive that there is a benefit for that control. And that is that the costs sort of outweigh the benefits. And when we throughout the report, we talk about that this benefit, that the costs outweigh the benefits outweigh the costs. And we talk about costs in the broadest sense. So the cost that a consumer might face directly, the cost that they may face indirectly if, say, they can't use their air conditioner and that has a utility value to them, and that's a potential indirect cost, and both perceived and real costs. So costs, perceptions of a lack of privacy, perceptions that the control might have a big brother type effect, all of those potential costs we take into account when determining whether that control program has economic legitimacy at the personal level. The other attributes are social political legitimacy. So this is the concept that the DER control program is fair and that the costs and benefits are fairly distributed between those undertaking the control and those subject to the control. On the right, the interactional trust, so that the institution who has prepared the DER control program and that they continue to engage with those subject to control and engage in that mutual dialogue. And so the concept of trust and consumers' trust in energy institutions is critical there. And then at the top, the sort of high level aspiration is to achieve institutionalized trust. So this is where those institutions governing the DER control programs work hand in hand with, say, consumer advocacy groups, and that these control programs are developed in combination with an enduring regard for each other's interests. All right, next slide. Oh, the colours have changed slightly, gone a bit crazy on this one, so apologies. But on the this slide is intending to show the public and how social license depends on whether there are public or private benefits for the DER control program. So we'll start in the bottom quadrant, which is where there might be an activity which has a private benefit but has a public cost and risk. And this is really where social license has been traditionally used in the corporate social governance field, where we have corporations such as mining companies who are undertaking activities which have public costs and risks such as environmental or community costs. So this is where the concept of social license really first arose, and that it was companies would seek to obtain that social license by attempting to reduce that public cost or risk. So things like providing some of the returns into community programs, biodiversity offsets, those sorts of things. We've seen those corporations attempting to achieve a social license using those mechanisms. But perhaps what's newer and the field of social license doesn't necessarily cover comprehensively yet is in the top left-hand corner, where we focused our report. And these are activities that are undertaken for a public benefit, but tend to have a private cost or risk. And so we can think about all sorts of programs that might fit in that quadrant that are typically undertaken by governments, where they may be controlling what the public needs to do in order, which has a private cost, in order to deliver a public benefit. And that's where we sit in terms of DER control. So regardless of whether you're in the top left or bottom right, those institutions should be striving to enter into the top right quadrant to try to transfer, to the extent possible, the costs into the benefits. So we operate in a quadrant where we're receiving both private benefits and public benefits. Now, that's not always possible. It may be that we have to remain in the area where there's a private cost in order to deliver public benefit. But where we do stay in that area, then we have to recognise that there's a high potential cost or effort in obtaining and maintaining that social licence. Okay, next slide. So our report sort of has three main proposals, which sort of need to be accepted before we can move on with the framework that we then present. The three proposals are that wherever there is DER control has private costs, and that's really most of the time where at least part of the community perceives there to be a direct, indirect, real or perceived cost, then a social licence must be obtained. Then secondly, we say that the cost and effort required to gain and maintain that social licence is related to two main variables, and that's the extent of consumer choice, so how mandatory or voluntary the program is, and whether those private costs are outweighed by private benefits, and that's for all consumers that are subject to DER control. And of course, those private costs and private benefits will not be homogenous and will vary depending on the individual customer's perceptions. And thirdly, that the obtaining a social licence and maintaining a social licence is critical, because without that social licence, what we then are likely to see is a reduced uptake or potentially opt-out of programs that are voluntary. And for programs that are mandatory, where there's a lack of social licence, we propose that there will be reduced compliance, or that there will be a high cost in order to maintain compliance and enforce the requirements of the mandatory program. And whenever you have either of those first two dot points, then there's a potential inability to achieve the program objectives, so that a social licence is critical to achieving the objectives of DER control. Okay, again, the colours have gone a little crazy on this, so apologies if you refer to the report. They're a lot less psychedelic, but here in this chart we can see this is our framework that we're proposing, that those who are designing and implementing a DER control program, that this is the framework that can be used in both the design and implementation. So we see those two variables being the level of choice, and on the y-axis, and the net private cost to consumers with DER on the x-axis. And there is an asterisk there because costs, which has fallen off, but the costs we define there as in the broadest terms, that the costs are both those perceived, real, direct, and indirect. So if we go through the y-axis, the level of choice is lowest on the top of the y-axis, and the most on the bottom. So at the top, a DER control program could be mandatory for all customers, mandatory with exemptions, or mandatory for a select subset. Say new DER customers is for example where we're seeing a lot of the new mandatory control requirements coming in for new DER customers. So that would be a mandatory for a subset categorization. Then we go into programs that are opt-in and opt-out. So there's some programs which are opt-out, which then have a penalty, you can opt out up front, but there's a penalty or cost to doing so. Where you're able to opt in up front, but where there's a penalty or cost for later opt-out. Opt-out upfront, opt-in with no penalty or cost for later opt-out being the preferred in terms of the level of choice. And then we work our way down to the next category, where the individual events within that DER control program give you a level of choice, and that's either opt-out or opt-in with penalties or costs, or no penalty or costs. Then on the bottom, we have the level of private costs. On the right-hand side, where there's the highest cost in gaining and obtaining a social licence, we have a high net private costs, where the costs are high for most customers and they exceed the benefits. So it will never be all customers, but for the majority of customers, if we're in that right-hand side, we have a high net private cost for most customers. And then moving to the left, where the net benefits are high. So overall, I guess you can think of those programs which sit in the top right-hand corner. These are sort of the programs which are most mandatory, the hardest for customers to accept, and they tend to have a sort of a safety or criticality, critical type of public benefit that's trying to be delivered. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, these are the sort of no-brainers, where customers who see that they have a high benefit and they can easily opt in to individual events and there's no penalty to them, and they tend to be the no-brainer type activities. So to use some examples, we'll go to the next slide. So using some examples outside of the energy industry in terms of how programs that have public benefits, but potentially private costs are implemented. So the classic example, I guess, is the COVID lockdown. And now we've all of this is quite subjective, but for argument's sake, we've put COVID lockdown in the top right-hand corner. It's mandatory for all. No exemptions, or very few exemptions able to be granted. And for a number of people, those costs have a high net private cost of staying locked down. And so in that example, we would suggest that there's a high cost and effort in obtaining and maintaining that social licence. And that's exactly what we saw during the COVID lockdowns. There was a high cost and effort in terms of premiers getting up in front of the public every day, intending to maintain that social licence for the COVID lockdown. The mask mandates, which we haven't got here, I guess they're sort of, there's a lot of exemptions for those, so they tend to fall down and the costs maybe are not as high. But you can also see here that there's a lot of heterogeneity in these assessments. So for some people, the COVID lockdown might sit relatively in the middle, that the costs are not so high, but yet and they perceive those public benefits to be private benefits because they do benefit the community. There's a few other examples. So if we're down in this bottom right-hand corner, this tends to be the more altruistic type area of the framework, where we have customers or the public wanting to partake in a program that has high net private costs because of the public benefits, and so they're willing to take on that net private cost. And I guess in terms of that, there's only the majority of the community, they would not partake in that program because they perceive the private cost to be higher than their private benefits. But for some people, a small subset of the community, they may undertake volunteering because they're able to shift, for them at least, that activity into this right-hand side, because that public benefit then manifests in a private benefit as well. If you're in the top left-hand corner, there's not many examples here, but for theory's sake, I think the activities that sort of sit in this mandatory for all, but also have high net private benefits, this is what the sort of things that you might make people do for their own good, I guess is how you might characterise those. And anything in the bottom corner, we have an example here of the New South Wales government active kids vouchers. Whenever you, in New South Wales, whenever you enrol your child in an accredited sporting activity, then you can obtain vouchers to pay for that activity, and that has high net private benefits. It's a bit of a no-brainer, and you can opt in to doing so. The health sphere, looking in the health domain, is actually quite useful. The My Health record, when we all got to decide whether we were going to opt out of having our health details made available by the My Health record, there were quite a few people who, I guess, in there, they perceived individually that they were sitting more in this area, and so they got to opt out with no cost. But for the majority of the population, it generally sat in here, and there was a lot of work done to try to gain and maintain a social licence for undertaking that program, by addressing some of those perceptions, at least, of the potential disbenefits of signing up for My Health. Right, we might move to the DR examples on the next page. So we have a few examples here, and what we generally found is that the programs tended to sit in two main areas. We had the programs, the South Australian Smarter Homes programs, static export limits and dynamic operating envelopes, which are more mandatory type programs and tend to be implemented because there's a system security or network risk issue that these programs are attempting to address. So by addressing those, it is important that we get a high level of uptake of that particular program, close to mandatory for a subset of consumers at least. And so therefore, they sit more to the top of the framework. We're also suggesting that these programs will have a high net private cost, at least until the benefits can be better explained, that there's a high net private cost to the majority of consumers in the way they perceive those potential costs and benefits. So there was, I think, and this is all subjective again, but there is we had a lot of debate around where dynamic operating envelopes should sit and how they then relate to static export limits that I guess, dynamic operating envelopes by themselves are, you may perceive that there's a potential benefit in opting in or not opting out of dynamic operating envelopes in avoiding the static export limits. But also what we proposed was that that the social license for static export limits has not necessarily been gained yet. And so these consumers who may have the choice to opt in or opt out of a dynamic operating envelope to a static export limit, these consumers may perceive that, that this isn't actually a benefit, because they will compare their arrangement to their neighbour's arrangement who don't have static export limits or dynamic operating envelopes in place. So they may potentially perceive dynamic operating envelopes to have a net private cost, at least compared to their neighbours, and therefore there is a cost and effort in obtaining and maintaining the social licence for dynamic operating envelopes and static export limits as well, so that there is work to be done for those energy institutions proposing these sorts of arrangements. In the bottom left-hand corner, this is where we get the more voluntary type schemes, which don't apply to all consumers, and there tends to be a benefit or an incentive for those consumers who opt in. So we've got the Peak Smart air conditioning programs in Queensland, where there is an upfront, you cannot elect to opt in upfront. We've suggested there is a penalty or cost for later opt-out. That's due to their, if you do wish to disconnect that dread device, there is some sort of a fee associated with an electrician undertaking that for you. Similarly with hot water load control, which a large number of networks already offer. We have two Californian programs here. The EV Charge Forward is a PG and E electric vehicle demand response program, which is opt-in, but then the EV users can then opt out at any time, but they're sort of locked into to the event. Rates, which is again a Californian program, which allows consumers to select their preferences for how their electric heating, cooling, water use, water pumping, and batteries, if they do have them, how they may consume electricity and how they may be that consumption may be shifted. Consumers can choose whether they have a sort of a preset set and forget automated type response, or they can choose to manually undertake that or opt out of individual events. But again, there is a penalty to the opting out of individual events. If you exceed your quota of demand in that individual in that period that you've been subscribed to, then there is a penalty for opting out of individual events. The behaviour trials between ARENA and AEMO for the RERT. There's a large number of residential behaviour trials where customers were sent text messages to say if they wanted to opt out of individual events. And then the last one we've got here is the New South Wales and South Australian demand response schemes, which are only now just being designed. And at this point, we don't have I guess, clear guidance on how they're going to look, but likely to have a sort of opt out or opt-in type approach. So we can talk through, I'd love to hear everybody's comments on where we've placed these. Like I said, it is subjective, and I think as Lynne and Chris both talked about, this framework is intended to start a conversation around how we might design and implement these programs with consideration of the cost and effort of the social license that is involved. I think you'll also note that there's none of these programs we've categorized as the black color. They're all able to obtain a social license, but we'd like to highlight that anything that's more towards the top right-hand corner, there's going to be ongoing effort required to gain and maintain that social license. Okay. So with all this as well, there are potential equity issues. Not all customers are the same, and some customers are going to be able to better participate, and some customers are going to have higher costs if they do participate. So we suggest there's two areas of the framework where there's likely to be equity issues which should also be considered. So on the top right, where there are high net private costs, in this area, there's like where those costs are highly heterogeneous, so that some customers are particularly impacted by a mandatory setting. So here we might think about elderly or more vulnerable customers who maybe can't have their air conditioning disrupted for those particular customers that there is a high net private cost of a mandatory program. And so in those sorts of programs, we suggest that the equity issues could be considered by identifying those customers who do have those high net private costs, and then at least compensating them, or potentially using an exemption or some of these subset or exemption type design characteristics to address those equity issues. Then in the bottom left-hand corner as well, there's potential for equity issues for a different reason here, and this is to do with the accessibility of those net private benefits to those consumers. So we talked about this area being the no-brainer part of the framework, but for some customers they can't access those benefits. So if they are based on batteries, for example, then only a small subset of customers at the moment anyway are able to access those benefits due to the capital outlay of batteries. So we suggest that where a program lies in this bottom left-hand corner, then there might be a need to ensure that those benefits aren't, windfall type benefits, so to make sure that they're not at the cost of all other consumers. So there's potential analogies there with feed-in tariffs that may have been set too high in the past, and having all customers potentially pay for those with only a smaller subset of customers receiving those benefits. So that care should be given that these private benefits here for these consumers are not at the cost of the other consumers, to the extent where that attribute of fairness starts coming into play. And then if this is perceived as unfair, then it has the potential to bring the whole program down due to that social license not being achieved because of the cost, the consideration of fairness issues. So we suggest for both of these equity issues, they need to be considered where they exist, because otherwise the social license could potentially fall down on that characteristic of fairness. Okay, next slide. So I think how to actually get that social license. We propose that for private benefits need to exceed private costs to the extent possible. It's always going to be difficult to achieve that for all customers, but to the extent possible, the program should be designed so that private benefits exceed private costs, remembering private costs are defined in a broader sense. So for voluntary programs, we're suggesting that market-based programs do make it easier to maintain and gain that social license, because customers can choose to respond, and therefore you're increasing the level of choice. And also important is removing barriers to opting out. So this is where technical standards may come in place, things like manual overrides to enable opt-out. And also in this one, there's certain programs as well where a customer might have signed up to a program and then they move house, and the person moving in doesn't know how to opt out. So considerations of those sorts of things need to be taken into account to remove those barriers, depending on how the DER control passes from consumer to consumer. For mandatory programs, one potential option is to provide compensation for any private costs in order to shift that net benefit upwards. We also propose that including exemptions for those subsets of consumers, so the more vulnerable consumers who may not be able to afford to have their air conditioning for health reasons turned off or impacted, that for those customers you might consider exemptions. And then reconsider the need for a mandatory program, or how mandatory does the program actually need to be. And then for all programs, we suggest that the consumer engagement, so increasing that trust element of the program, is critical. So engagement to educate and reduce the perception of private costs is important. Many of the costs we've talked about so far are perceived costs, and so there is a real opportunity to reduce those via education and engagement. And then the next point is to explain how the public benefit will personally benefit consumers. So many consumers may be motivated by the public benefit in and of itself, but for some consumers it's important to explain how that public benefit will personally benefit consumers. So a blackout is less likely to occur, In the case of the COVID lockdowns, it was by saying that we'll make sure that your great grandmother is safe. Those sorts of things to explain how that public benefit will personally benefit individual consumers. Next slide. The trust and fairness element. This can be improved by making sure the control is only undertaken for the purpose of delivering the program's expressed objectives. And this is especially important where we have third parties undertaking the control. So there's a role for energy institutions to make sure that the third party is clear that of the purposes of that control and that they're only using that control for those expressed objectives. Transparency at the program level is critical to show how the program is delivering on its objectives, how it is improving system security, how it is minimising network risks if they're the particular objectives. At the consumer level, providing transparency in how the control that's being delivered is giving rise to consumer benefits. This one's also important to making sure that that social licence is maintained. If the consumer perceives that those benefits are being eroded or undermined, then that social licence could be lost. So we're suggesting to provide transparency at the consumer level in terms of how they're benefiting from the control that's been undertaken in any given period. Surprises have a large potential to remove that social licence. The social licence takes a lot of work to gain and maintain, but it can be taken away very easily, especially where surprises do occur. So the sorts of surprises we are talking about is where customers can't opt out, or there's a high cost of opt out, and this can be due to lack of understanding of the contracts they may have signed up to, or lack of understanding of the technology. And then where consumers are surprised because they're unable to opt out because of the high cost of opting out. So the sorts of scenarios where a customer needs to get an electrician in to disable the control, those sorts of surprises, if they're not made clear up front or if they're embedded into the design of the control program, then they have the potential to impact trust and fairness and undermine the social licence. The ongoing evaluation of the program, again, this is about maintaining the social licence. It's not just that it's received once up front, it is an ongoing effort and cost to maintain that. And so the program could be evaluated via consumer engagement to understand how the consumer is experiencing the DER control and to make sure that the program is adjusted over time if any issues arise. And we already talked around the equity issues that can appear if we're operating in the top right or bottom left of the framework, and they can be addressed by program design or complementary measures. Okay, that was the presentation. So I can see questions.
Brilliant.
But I'll hand back to Chris.
Thanks, Melanie. And I'm watching the chat, and I think people have very cleverly migrated from the chat to the Q&A. Of course, when you're using the webinar function in Zoom, you get this great Q&A functionality, and there's a fantastic conversation happening in that Q&A section, which we'll get to shortly. But first, we might go to reflections, both, I guess, on the report and what's happening out there in the real world right now, starting with Vince Duffy from South Australia. And I think, Vince, we've got a chart that you want to help to put what you're seeing and trying to manage into context. So thanks, Vince.
Well, thanks, everyone. I appreciate being given an opportunity to participate in the discussion today. I think it's worth just going out at the start to say that South Australia is committed to addressing the energy trilemma of assuring the lowest sustainable prices whilst maintaining reliability for consumers and reducing carbon emissions. South Australia is leading in the adoption of renewable energy and distributed energy resources, with renewable energy providing almost 57% of energy production during 2019-20. And our ambition is to be 100% net renewable by the 2030s. So the customer uptake of solar PV has been extraordinary. And I think this graph highlights that and some of the challenges that are evolving, with 1 in 3 households in South Australia having PV installed. SA Power Networks estimates that we currently have more than 1,500 megawatts of installed capacity on households, which is equivalent to the overall average demand of South Australia over the year. In aggregate, this is the largest generator now in South Australia, and the reality is that we have limited control of these important assets. And I'll get to the graph in a minute, but with regard to the report, my sort of initial feedback, the concept of social licence is an interesting proposition. Social licence is an important framework for the regulation of the resource and energy companies within the South Australian Department of Energy and Mining. However, applying it to governments, I think, is somewhat problematic. I can assure people that governments are acutely aware of the impact of policy changes on customers. And generally, elections provide a formal processes for governments to seek social licence. I think that the report has misallocated the Smarter Homes program in the assessment. Whilst it is an emergency backstop obligation, the private costs are likely to be minimal. The increased standards that have been met by a large number of inverters, retaining competitive outcomes for consumers, while the majority of agents are providing their service at no cost to consumers. The actual activation, likely to be relatively infrequent and for short periods of time, will have very limited cost on consumers. The recent use of the capacity in South Australia may have cost an individual customer about $1 in lost revenue from their PV system. The report very focused on the private costs of individual consumers. In public policy, usually a much broader concept of public value is considered. As an economist, we would usually look for a market failure to be identified and then consider the costs and benefits of taking action to address the identified failure. In the case of DER, conceptually, I could make a case for there being both externalities and public good characteristics associated with exports from DER. From a system security perspective, the system black in South Australia in 2016 imposed costs estimated at more than $367 million by Business SA. That being said, South Australia is looking forward to the future of low-priced, carbon-free energy, with customers unlocking the full value of their investments in new technology. While emergency backstop mechanisms are required to manage the system as a last resort, we want to see technology, markets and incentives that customers can respond to and fully optimise their investment and avoid the need for use of these backstop mechanisms. Now, with regard to the graph that we've got up on board, this is a graph that I pinched off AEMO. What it shows you is on the 11th of October last year, the performance over the day. And you can see the light yellow area is the production of energy from PV over the day, hollowing out the middle, the so-called infamous duck curve. The darker yellow is the grid scale PV. The green is wind and the blue is gas-fired generation. What you can see around that lunchtime period is that for about 2 hours, South Australia was fully, demand was being fully met by PV, or both at household and grid scale. And that's a really great look to the future as we go forward. But you can also see that that blue band was being exported. Now, it's just the way the graphs worked, because the electrons, aren't generally identified as who goes where, but we did need the interconnector to have that capacity to go interstate so that we could keep the system in balance and keep it operating in a secure manner. And we hit an all-time record low of 300 megawatts of scheduled operational demand from the grid. So that's the area that's being serviced by the NEM generators. The blue part you need to have in place. So the gas-fired generation at this point in time is required to provide those essential system services. So if we didn't have the interconnector available on this day, it would have been very problematic for the system to operate in a secure manner with that much PV operating without any control over it. So the government did last year in September implement Smarter Homes packages based upon a comprehensive report we received from AEMO about how do we manage minimum demand going forward. And effectively, we actually had to utilise it just the other weekend, where we were on a single interconnector circuit with Victoria because of planned maintenance work. And to maintain the system in case of the loss of that interconnector, while maintaining those generators and having sufficient demand in the system, AEMO's advice now is that we need to have at least 400 megawatts of demand to enable the system to be secure in an island state. And so that's what we had to utilise, and we did activate the smarter homes as well as the SCADA controlled PV. The interesting part of it, because this whole day had been a largely negative price period where the energy being sent to the market actually had negative value, most of the embedded large-scale generation had already turned off to avoid paying for the privilege of generating. So the activation of the smarter homes and the enhanced voltage management system managed to increase the demand to 400 to manage for the credible loss of the interconnector. So I think the challenge we face is going forward with such a valuable resource, we're going to have some form of control. Our goal in South Australia is to have fully optimised markets and voluntary action by consumers as the primary mechanism to achieve these balancing of the market in real time, and only having emergency control schemes used in those sort of emergency conditions, much like we do currently have under frequency load shedding to manage for non-credible events, and other control schemes like generation shedding schemes for grid scale generators to manage an over frequency event. And these get utilised very infrequently. The longer we go without reforming the market to get control in place through voluntary programs and incentives, the more likely we have to continue to rely on backstop mechanisms. So I think that's my overview, Chris.
Brilliant. Thanks, Vince. And I guess just a sort of a quick follow-up before we go to Violette. And I'll just pre-warn Violette that once we switch over to you, Violette, I'll just get you to make sure your video and sound is on. But I'm looking at an article about what happened a couple of weekends ago, Vince, that says that, and the title, switching off rooftop solar will become an important feature of a renewables grid. And I think, am I right in what I'm hearing from you is the sort of longer term South Australian vision is actually to get to a point where, the grid's managed through voluntary market-based means, that we're actually trying to build a system where that's not necessarily necessary. What we're talking about in the current context is more of a backstop.
Absolutely. What we've implemented backstop emergency control mechanisms, and our aim and desire is for markets to work really effectively to signal the value in real time. And I think we talked about dynamic operating envelopes, and that's the next stage of the Smarter Homes package, is to make sure that we have the capability in place to implement dynamic export constraints going forward, where the vision that SA Power Networks has is that during most periods of the year, you can export beyond the hard limit of 5 kilowatts, but on some days you do need to be managed back down to 0 to ration the available capacity. So having that optimised and then utilising all new technology to help balance the system will be fantastic. It's not really part of this, and I haven't got the picture, but there has been a LinkedIn discussion about whose batteries got utilised as part of a VPP, and certainly my battery that I've got in my house was discharged quite strongly on that Friday afternoon for the pre-event of the Torrens Island, where it got utilised as an alternate source of supply in South Australia when we had a technical fault down at Torrens Island. So this concept of it's a fantastic opportunity to have resources available to help supplement as we transition towards the future.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you, Vince. And Violette, an AEMO perspective.
Good morning, and thank you, Chris, and really appreciate the opportunity to join the panel and this really important conversation around social licence. I think Vince stole my thunder with a lot of the stats, so I won't go and repeat some of the stats. But I suppose what we're seeing at AEMO more broadly is we are, as Vince highlighted, seeing a significant uptake of rooftop solar PV, not only in South Australia, but across Australia, including East Coast and West Coast as well. And, you know, some of the challenges that we see operationally, I think really where we were trying to turn to this conversation was really how do we turn some of those challenges into probably more of an opportunity, not only for those consumers who have DER, but those consumers who decide not to have DER. And it's a very important conversation that we talk about social license for all consumers as we here servicing their needs. I mean, there is a lot occurring in the DER space. And one of the things I suppose AEMO was very, very mindful of as part of the whole discussion around distributed energy resources is this concept of understanding consumers a little bit better. I mean, we may not necessarily control, and there's a lot of really interesting conversation in the chat about the term control and management and consent and consent through third parties, but we may not necessarily directly control the resources, but we always act through other parties. And, you know, while we kind of say we're really at arm's length, we're very conscious of the consequences and implications of not only some of the operational decisions that we make, but some of the input we make into reform agenda and the way we go about implementing reform and how you bring, you know, the consumer, also not only consumers with distributed resources, but consumers who decide not to into the considerations. And factor that very clearly up front in some of those considerations. I mean, there are a number of examples presented in the pack around pieces of work that we've been involved in where social license is quite critical. I mean, you know, the DR trials that we had, we did sort of 3 years ago, which was a 3-year trial with ARENA, was really around how we work through actors and bring and get, you know, obviously opt-in sort of provision to encourage people to participate in the provision of sort of peak shaving type service. And that was highly successful, and we got really great insights from some of those trials, not only in terms of consumers' uptake of some of these things, but the evolution of the product and service and technology offerings from the various actors in the market was really quite interesting to see based on some of those learnings. I mean, the VPT trial, it was also mentioned in that piece, and you know what we've been very, very conscious of as part of that trial was to bring some consumer insights into that piece of work. And we released recently the Csba report, which was the first of 2 reports, and some of the drivers behind why consumers participate in VPPs, and some of the was around, you know, what it does to their energy bills. Their willingness to be part of something pioneering was something that sort of really came through, which was really interesting. Opportunities to be more cleaner in energy was another thing as well, and the broader, and how they assist the broader community. So this kind of public kind of aspect was critical. So I mean, a lot of these learnings are really quite important as part of how we think about social license for, you know, people with DER and those without. But I mean, the report is a really interesting report. I think it's a great framework, and happy to work in collaboration with the consumer groups and others as to how we might apply some of those insights to various pieces of work. I might just leave it there, Chris. Happy to sort of talk through a few of those things as we unpack the morning.
Brilliant. Thanks, Violette. That's fantastic. And I might now go to, I guess we're starting to look longer term, and particularly in the context of post-2025 and what the framework might be to actually create voluntary markets around all this DER. And that's a great segue to Jo Witters. Thank you, Jo. And we'll just make sure your video and sound is on.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to come along today. Yeah, I was lucky to get the final slot, whereby I can obviously take in the feedback across the other speakers and have had the benefit of seeing some of the chat come in as well, which it is really interesting to see the level of engagement is really high, which is great. I just sort of wanted to build on some of the points that have been made there. You know, setting that context, obviously here in Australia, we've got, really abundant natural renewable resources, and we're seeing that as Australia already leading the way in DER integration. Customers really are leading the way. Over 2.6 million households have made those decisions to put solar PV assets on their roofs, as Vince pointed out. South Australia leading the way at the frontier there already. So the work we're doing in post 2025 is about making sure we can properly integrate those resources into the markets and unlock the value there for customers, making sure we're actually delivering that value as best we can going forward. And I think, I have some sympathy with some of the points raised in the chat regarding some of that language around control, because I think control does have that connotation about less choice, and I think it's it's a good discussion to be having about what is it that we mean for customers in that space. And I think for where we're coming from, the focus of our work is about trying to enable versus sort of mandating those changes for DER. What we're looking to do is, I guess, creating that ecosystem whereby different third parties, so retailers and aggregators, can come in and offer products and services to customers, which they might choose to take up if they value them and go forward. So in the same way that as a customer now, I can accept an offer from my retailer or switch retailer if I see a better offer going forward. That's the same, but there might just be a broader range of choices which could then unlock value from different technology or smart devices in my home. Or if I'm a customer with DER, I'm not, but if I was, I might be able to then unlock further value from some of those assets. So that's really, I guess, the context of what we're working at. So the first point I guess I wanted to make in that, and thinking about that context of gaining that social license, the way I see it is, I think that framing puts the customer, or thinking about that is, it puts the customer much more in the driver's seat. That customer should be determining what products and services suit their needs, what they're willing to sign up for, under what conditions, and I guess for what price. So I guess first up, I think when we talk about customer engagement, often that has a connotation that customers are going to have to do more and going to have to be really active in the market. That's not really where we're trying to come from. What we're trying to do is making sure customers should have that choice. That's not about customers having to sort of sit there watching their meters, watching things, and really actively participating in the wholesale market. In the same way, if I'm signed up to a retailer now, they are, putting their portfolio together with all of their retail customers and engaging in the wholesale market on our behalf. Going forward, that same, I guess, principle holds true, that in future, I might be, say, perhaps having some different types of energy products that I'm accessing or making choices to sign up to. One of which might be for my energy. Another one, I might have two providers, one of which who could manage the use or the, I guess, connection with my electric vehicle, for example. And so making those choices is really what we're trying to enable that customers can do, and that vehicle provider, energy provider, could then be bundling that up through sort of an aggregated source and providing that flexibility back to the market. Overall, offering value both to the system, but really at the key is providing that value back to the customer as well, and unlocking value to the customer. So I think that thinking about the social license through that perspective, where it's customers making those choices, really does change the discussion, and I think builds on, I guess, where Vince, I believe, is coming from, thinking of as at the moment they're in backstop territory, but going forward, that's really, I guess, the direction where you want to be seeing the bulk of that, and backstops really being there exactly as an emergency sort of lever that you're very rarely using. I guess the second point I wanted to make is about, in the past, demand side participation has had a really, I guess it had a fairly on-off type response to it, where customer load would be turned off to balance the needs of the grid, and very much, and so where you had like a lot of larger customers perhaps were able to participate in those sort of schemes where they were able to shut off parts of their processes quickly. But I guess the very nature of those sort of on-off needs, or the way that the market was able to facilitate that, meant that was also one of the reasons why it was very difficult for a lot of customers to be able to participate and engage in that way. I think in future, with a lot more solar on the grid, reducing grid demand during the day, similar to the chart that Vince showed before, I guess what is increasingly valuable to the system is where those different demand or supply sources can be flexible to either shift to those times of the day where they're most valued, i.e. if you've got a pool pump or if you've got some sort of smart tech that can work with a hot water device and shift some of that load to different points of the day. Those resources can act like a sponge and soak up the solar, soak up that supply. So where customers do have that flexible demand and want to recognise, A, not all customers can, absolutely, and B, even those customers that can will have some demand that is flexible and some that is not. But particularly where they might have some flexibility through home energy devices or DER as technology evolves in future, those customers should be rewarded by offering that flexibility to the market and providing support to the system as a whole. So in that context, I think demand side response changes from a much more sort of binary or off sense to a more about where demand can offer flexibility in the same way that supply resources have done in the past as well, or have been able to be valued for that. And I guess that the other point there is with technology evolving, the other factor is that it doesn't necessarily mean that customers will go without. So it might be about some smart tech working its magic in the background to adjust the settings on home air conditioning units, for example, turning it up or down a few degrees. And if they can do that, across, tens of thousands of units that they have signed up in aggregate, they can be offering that flexibility into the market. And those customers, I guess overall really aren't seeing a lot of change in terms of what they're experiencing in the home. But by being prepared to sign up to those contracts and offer those on those terms, that's a choice they can make if they want to receive and receive value for that flexibility, because there will be a value there. So I think that's, I guess, the shift in terms of how we're thinking about how we can use that. I think Lynne made the point at the start that DER and technology is a real enabler for this, and I think I'd firmly agree with that. The final point I wanted to make just before passing back, so Chris, I know I've gone over my 2 minutes, is that arrangements do need to work for all customers, and I think Melanie, you made the point there about that it's important to get it right and maintaining that social license for that it doesn't just work for those with DER, it needs to work for those without. And I again firmly agree with that. So one thing we've been trying to do and that we're building into our future designs is a risk assessment tool where we're thinking about how to make sure customers have fit for purpose and adequate protections going forward. So as these new products and services emerge, what you don't want to have is that some customers are left behind through those sort of offers emerging, or equally where people are trying these new services and products, you want them to be able to opt out of those to the extent they try them. Is there sort of some sort of safe default? So if you want to go back to the sort of more vanilla product, what does that mean? You shouldn't be penalised for that. And I think those are principles that I think is we want to be building in. And I think from my perspective, I'd be really keen on others' views today and how they think that can help build that social license. Thanks, Chris.
Brilliant, thanks, Joe. And I think the point you make around sort of binaries is really interesting, because I think we tend to have these, many of the debates about this transition in kind of very on-off terms. So DER on and off, public or private, and these things are seen as being in tension, the reality versus the perception of what these new mechanisms are. And I think there's some great debates in the chat about, I saw Gabrielle had a good comment about, well, I think dynamic operating envelopes are actually over here. Right. But are they perceived as being over here? And then the other one, of course, is DER haves and DER have-nots, and depending how we define DER, and I think there's another discussion that our chair, Louise Silverman, has put in, is thinking, well, we're not just talking about solar potentially here. DER is hot water, DER is pool pumps, DER is potentially how we manage our use in the home. So I guess what I'm hearing from you, Joe, is maybe we want to get away from some of these binaries and start to think about things in a more nuanced way.
I think that's right, and I don't think that's, yes would be my answer to that. But I think it's incumbent on all of us to get better at how we talk about that and make sure it's. I think that sometimes there's this conversation that we need to educate consumers, and I sort of cringe a little bit, with how that's not really. I think we as a sector we need to sort of get better at how we're actually not only thinking about these things, but at actually valuing, those different resources and then communicating them collectively. So I think it's we can learn a lot from those different perspectives as well. It's not just educating one way. I think it's got to be designing that future.
Brilliant, thanks, Jo. And that's a really nice segue to Lynne, whose favourite topic is not the binary but flexibility, which is more nuanced than that. Lynne, what should we make of all this? I'm sure you've been following in the chat. Your quick reflections before we open it up.
Yeah, look, thanks, Chris. And I have been following the chat, and it's great. I don't think we're going to get to answering all of it today. So again, we started this webinar with the view that what we want is a dialogue, and I think we're getting one. And but it won't just be today. It's going to keep going. Just a couple of things so that we can get to questions. I just want to underline as well, and apologies if I don't hit the points that are the things that most matter to any individual. I do like the fact that over the course of the discussion, we've gone from the near term and the backstop to the future and the future focus, because as Chris says, I'm obsessed with getting what we often call demand side participation, but I actually call flexibility. In other words, people willing to shift their load, manage their generation, if we want to get that at scale. I guess what we're focusing on is the digital technology, the smart technology is the thing that's going to make that possible. No one wants to get a text while they're at the office saying, could you turn your air conditioner down right now, because otherwise we're going to give you a 200% price increase. Digital technology makes a whole lot of things so much easier, so much simpler. But what it doesn't do, and that's what this paper is really about, is thinking about the permission structure for that. There's been a lot of really good discussion about the use of the word control. I guess where some of that comes from is using the words of Cass Sunstein, who's one of the Nudge authors. What Cass actually says is people hold two mutually inconsistent, or humans hold two mutually inconsistent views at the same time, which is they both want to conserve or preserve cognitive and emotional bandwidth. In other words, have plenty of time for the things that matter, that they're emotional about, which means passing control to others, right? We get intermediaries to do all kinds of things. We outsource all kinds of things in our lives, and that's an impulse we have, or a desire we have, to have more time for the things that are important. But at the same time, we have a fear of losing control. So even things like when we think about outsourcing, having somebody come to do our cleaning, people have fears about security, or if people's got their key. There's similar issues at play here. So it isn't that we're not talking about, or we're not saying control or management, or passing these issues, passing management or control over your energy use or your generation to others is not something you should be doing, even in a public benefit externality sense. It's what's the permission architecture, and that's really what CutlerMerz is, the job CutlerMerz has done for us in producing this report.
Brilliant, thank you, Lynne. So now we get to the broader Q&A, and what I might do is ask our panelists all to put their videos and speakers on, so there'll be no hiding here. And what I might try and do, just because the Q&A has been so rich, is just try and roughly work through some of the themes that are emerging in the chat, and try and cover off things at the highest possible level. But as Lynne said, I think it's going to be difficult because there's so much good stuff in there. I might just start maybe with some of the near-term, I guess, questions that are coming through. And Vince, I'm looking at you. There's kind of a bunch of questions in there that I guess go to the actual circumstances you're facing in South Australia, the design of smarter homes, and what the future might look like. So I might just sort of throw a couple at you and see if you can shed some light for us. So just in more specific terms, the kind of control we're talking about being used here over the last few weekends or weekend. What does that mean for someone in their home or their business in terms of, in this case, solar coming into their home or being exported to the grid? How long do they experience that for? What does that look like? Because am I right that it's not just power not being exported, it's also power not being used in the home, or is that not how it actually works?
With the backstop mechanism, there's two mechanisms that were utilised under the Smarter Homes package. Was direct controls via the agent. So since September, each person who's installed a system needs to nominate an agent, which will have authorisation to control your output of your PV. So that was activated, and given it's only since September, I think it was about 10 megawatts of load that was activated, about 12,000 homes where their output was turned down or turned off because of the nature of it. Although it was recognised at the time that potentially no export to the grid was one option, that if the inverter is capable of that they could utilise that. So it was, if you had a battery and stuff like that, you could still utilise your PV internal and have it no exports, but generally it would turn your PV off. And so for that, most people didn't even know it had happened. Then there was what was called the enhanced voltage management, which is SA Power Networks has been investing in more dynamic control of voltage at their substations. And what that does is provides an all-year benefit of actually lowering voltage depending on the nature of the day most times, so that most people don't get tripped off, or the potential for people to get tripped off from high voltage in the distribution network is reduced. But it also provides a control mechanism where voltage can be slightly increased to reach the inverter limits and turn off PV via overvolting the network, or having a slightly higher voltage level than normal operating to reduce output of PV. I think the one that's so this is what's come through in the Smarter Homes, and that gave us another 40 megawatts, I think the number was, on this Sunday. And the overall, I think there was 17 megawatts of embedded generation that was more like commercial embedded generation that was also turned off, to make sure that we stayed above 400 megawatts, so that if we lost the interconnector, there would be sufficient demand for the conventional generation to be able to continue to operate securely in South Australia. So that was the nature of the event. It was managed a couple of Sundays ago. Basically turned off generation for most people, for the larger ones for an hour, and it was about 2 hours for the embedded or the Smarter Homes type stuff, just because the control and signalling for people to operate it is a bit slower. So it just took a bit longer to get them off and bring them back on. So if you look at what that would be worth, if you were exporting 5 kilowatts at maximum exports and you're on a 10-cent sort of feed-in rate, it might have cost you $1 over the 2 hours of lost revenue. And then you could say that you had to import a bit more energy for whatever your household consumption was, and that will vary between households. So the actual cost of the impact on any individual sort of small household was fairly small. But the potential, if we'd had a separation event and we were below, potentially the risk increases if we're well below 400 megawatts of demand, that the system wouldn't be stable enough to stay on, and the risk of a system black was a realistic risk. So as I said, the Business SA said the 2016 system black was worth about $367 million in impact on Business SA members. And so that's a very significant impact beyond the social impacts of people being without power. And then the challenge for the network operator, which is, the AEMO, is actually with that level of PV penetration, actually getting the system back started after it's off is a real problem when you have no control over PV. It is a possibility, if you go black on one of those days, that you may have to wait until the sun goes down before you can have a stable enough demand profile to start the system again. So rather than being the 4 hours that we're out in 2016, you could have an extended outage up until the evening before you can even start the process of connecting again. And we see that a bit in localized work by network operators now, where there's too much PV on a feeder. They can't actually put a generator on the feeder to stabilize the system without going around turning everyone's PV systems off, because there's just not sufficient control in the system to enable it to be stable. So that'll be I don't know if you've got anything to follow up, but that's sort of an overview.
So I guess, and I'm setting up a sort of, trying to move into this question of engagement, and particularly around perception and reality. And you can help me. So in terms of, and I think this was after event, there was communications back out to the community or the particular people who were affected in terms of what had happened. Well, what happened is the control that had been exercised.
On the Sunday morning, AEMO put a notice out to the market that there might be a requirement to activate this on the day. So it was, I think it was like 8 or 9 in the morning, there was a market notice. Now, unless you're an energy geek, I suppose you're not really monitoring your AEMO market notices to see what might happen. But in the end, what happened, it was activated, and then it was AEMO did an announcement on what the actual impact was on the Monday, or I think it was, put out a release on the Monday to say this is what we did and this is the level of impact it was. And then it got picked up by Renew Economy, and the debate started more broadly with ABC and the advertiser. But it was on the day we had no, SA Power Networks had no phone-ins of any complaints about voltage or being switched off. So the impact on the community from direct feedback at the time of the event was non-existent, I think is probably the best way, because we didn't get no one actually noticed at the time, or if they did notice, they weren't overly concerned at the time.
So this question, and I might go to you, Melanie, because I think one of the sort of the binaries in the chat has been around this perception versus reality issue. Now, Vince is sort of providing perspective that in South Australia, at least around this event, the perception of the reality might actually be quite well aligned. And in terms of this idea of moving people from the right to left in your matrix, is that a move that's based on some objective view about where people are or where they think they are? And how do these two issues come together?
Yeah, I think it's a good question in terms of the assessment process. I think, as I said in the presentation, that it is subjective, and to most accurately place the program requires input from a large number of stakeholders, where we can assess the costs and to what extent the perceived costs exceed the reality. I think for the Smarter Homes program, we've had a lot of discussion in the chat as well about whether we got the location right or wrong, with varying views. The other important point is that it's not static. So when we produced this report, which was December last year, the mechanism hadn't been used. There had been some concerns, I think, earlier on in the year about how the mechanism might work. And so to our minds, there was at least a perception among a not immaterial number of customers that the costs of this control mechanism may exceed the benefits. But then having the event actually take place, it might be a good time to reassess just exactly where do we now sit. Our perceptions now closer to the reality of the actual, the small direct costs that might have been received by consumers during the event a couple of weeks ago. So just the concept that you can move around, and that the social license, as you increase, you reduce those perceived costs, then you are able to shift that program further towards the left, and then that might then reduce the cost and effort required to continue to maintain that social license.
Thank you, Melanie. I might go to Violette on, I guess, in and around this engagement question on these different ways of managing the system, and what you're seeing and hearing from consumers through your VPP trials that sort of helps us get a sense of where people are right now and how we might need to engage with them to get to that kind of future where we've got voluntary market-based approaches.
I mean, I'm happy to talk about the VPP one. There's a few things, I suppose. I mean, Vince talked about the Smarter Homes program, which obviously we've been working very closely with SAPN and Electrina and others and on that one. I mean, on the VPP trial, I mean, I sort of highlighted initially one of the reasons why we wanted to sort of do the trial is, you know, while at the time, this was a couple of years ago now, we saw volumes were quite small and we wanted to get a little bit ahead of it in partnership with the industry to work out how do we integrate and enable effectively VPPs to aggregate resources and offer services to the system. And we really wanted to stress test some of the technical requirements we impose on some of those parties to make sure that we weren't creating unnecessary requirements or barriers to manage some of the operational issues. And so one of the things we're very, very mindful of early on as part of the knowledge sharing sort of considerations was we saw it as an opportunity to actually capture some consumer insights. We'd done some of the consumer insights in some of the work we had done a couple of years ago, but probably not to the extent we could have done, and we wanted to really capture it in the VPP trial, and we're doing it in some of the other ones as well. I mean, we've got one report that's been released, and I think we released it about a month ago. I mean, engagement from consumers has been really positive with the VPP trial. I think there's a lot of exciting innovation and hype around it. At the time we did the consumer insight study, we had maybe 1 or 2 VPPs, and they were actually located in South Australia. So a lot of it's very much focused on some of the South Australian consumer experience. And there's been a lot of effort in South Australia to really engage the consumer in some of these issues, particularly since the system broke. I mean, what are we learning from some of the consumer insights? I mean, we'll do a deeper one in 2-3 months' time when we've got more VPPs across some of the states, so we'll capture it. But I mean, some of the things we're learning from consumers is, you know, why they're engaged. They're getting benefit out of the VPP in terms of they're seeing directly how their bills are impacted in a positive way. The drivers for getting involved were not only just personal gain, but also community and broader climate-related sort of considerations, which is really, really interesting insight. So I think there was a lot of effort by some of the third parties, particularly around how they went about engaging and bringing on consumers onto the journey. And there was a lot of effort put there, and we can't underestimate how much effort is there, and we're sort of reaping some of the rewards of some of that engagement and bringing some of the consumers on. I suppose some of the insights are really interesting in a sense of how we understand maybe how we engage more broadly on, you know, opt-in and sort of some of the mechanisms we just talked about with respect to backstops around how we engage, how we communicate, how we bring people along is probably some insightful stuff coming out of this study. But there's a lot of other studies as well that you could leverage as well as part of those discussions.
Thanks, Violette. Now, I'm really conscious of time, and we barely scratched the surface of what's in the chat. So I think, as Lynne said, this was all about starting a dialogue, and I think we're going to have to continue the dialogue in other forums. So I'll wrap up shortly, but I might just quickly go to Lynne and Jo, maybe you first, Jo, for any final reflections from anything you've seen in the chat. I know you're looking to land post 2025 by the middle of the year. There's this concept of the maturity plan where I guess we'd hope that some of these ideas about how we work with people can be embedded. And then Lynne, your final reflections as well.
Yeah, I'll skate through a couple of points I just jotted down while I heard the others talk. I think in terms of the smarter homes piece, I'm sure Vince and Violette and others are all, you know, taking feedback and thinking about how that continues to evolve. And I think that's good. We're doing the work, you know, with those stakeholders and others as part of the post-2025, looking more broadly at minimum demand and how we actually address those challenges across other regions that are starting to see similar challenges going forward. You know, I think one thing I'd say to that is yes, we want to be absolutely moving towards the more voluntary measures and enabling customers to actually drive that through market solutions. It's a huge part of where we would sort of prefer to be moving that and enabling sort of any backstops to be exactly, just there as an emergency lever. The one thing I'd say is in the next few years, what you're actually going to start seeing coming onto the grid is likely to be much more electrification. So you're actually going to start to see electric vehicles. You're going to start to see, perhaps hydrogen technologies and other things that could start to change what those demand profiles start to look like anyway. So I'm not saying this is just a small problem that's going to go away, but I think actually you are going to need to keep, these arrangements are going to need to keep evolving as the needs of the system and as the needs of customers actually start to evolve. So I think it's almost an example of how we actually need to make sure we're being adaptive and evolving that going forward. Which then leads to your point then on the maturity plan. So there is not enough time to talk through all of that, but overall, yes, we're going to be putting out our to ministers recommendations regarding future designs by June. One thing we've said is that there is absolutely no way the sort of detailed design for how to actually fully integrate DER and enable that sort of full market response. The details of that will be sorted by then. So we've proposed a maturity plan approach whereby the details there would be worked through in a very collaborative co-design way together with stakeholders, and that range of input, particularly looking at things through a use case approach. What's happening now, what's happening in the next sort of, short horizon, we can really start to influence what the changes need to be to meet those needs. So, look forward to continuing those discussions. Thanks, Chris.
Excellent. Thanks, Joe. Lynne, I think you've got about 30 seconds.
Quick last word.
Yeah.
I think I'll just echo a point Joe made earlier. I mean, I think what's really positive makes me incredibly optimistic about what's in the chat, and the sort of back and forward of the discussion is no one turned around in the chat and said, let's educate consumers about what's good for them. Everyone was genuinely engaging, as the panel did, on what is the role of consumers in the future energy system, and what they actually think and say and do matters to actually the success of the future energy system. So that's sort of my reflection, I think, and thanks to everybody who's really put their thoughts into the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Lynne. And can I thank Melanie in the panel? As I said, we've barely scratched the surface of the feedback in the chat, and we actually are going to compile both feedback from the chat and invite people to send us further thoughts about either the framework itself or ways that we can actually gain and maintain and build social license. So I think there's going to be might be information on one of the slides, but the address is digital@energyconsumersaustralia.com. So we'll be working through that feedback and publishing an anonymised summary of what we hear as part of taking this dialogue forward. So I think at that point, I'm going to thank our audience for such, our huge audience for such great engagement and draw a line under our webinar. And I guess everyone stays safe. I'm on the west of in Western Australia where it's nice and dry, but I know it's not in many parts of the East Coast. So please do stay safe. Thanks for joining us, and really look forward to your feedback. So thank you.